The scent of decay became the mark his dynasty would rather forget, his passing a grim spectacle of disgrace. This is no legend, it is the somber fate of George II of Bavaria. He met his end not in the glory of combat or in the comfort of love, but in the depths of suffering, suffocating on his own bodily waste. How did a sovereign with unchecked authority descend into misery fit for no soul? Brace yourself, these are not the flourishes of folklore, but the raw, disturbing facts. For those who have made it this far, your resolve is commendable. Few could stomach such a story. George II embodied all the excesses the medieval era could breed. He was famously overweight, rowdy, insulated from consequence by his rank. Most days, he barely left his massive throne, an imposing seat wrapped in worn black leather. By his 40th year, his bulk exceeded 130 kilograms. His face was marred with dark purple splotches, the skin on his neck threatening to blur into his swollen frame, and his hands could not stop shaking. Among his people, he earned the whispered nickname George the Stinking. They only dared say it when well out of earshot. Whenever he entered a room, neither musicians nor bustling servants let the noise die down, perhaps trying to drown out the reality of his presence. Each motion from the Duke was punctuated by labored breathing, a chorus of muffled grunts and snores. Physical movement was an ordeal he rarely attempted or enjoyed. His habits at the table bordered on grotesque. Breakfast alone might see 5 roasted geese, piles of pastries, a barrel of dark ale, and an entire pitcher of wine spread before him. He tore into these feasts with bare hands, smearing grease across his lips and using his beard as a napkin. Servants would not dare approach him closely. The foulness of his breath, heavy with the odor of decaying teeth, easily overwhelmed any scent of fresh food. As chroniclers noted, his mouth reeked as if some small animal had died within it. His days ended much as they began, with sumptuous, endless banquets. Platters of cured meats, smoked fish, overflowing cheeses, fresh bread, and slabs of meat drowning in sauce were routine. It was not unusual for George to pass out mid-meal, requiring servants to clean food remnants from his face and garments. George II showed little mercy to women, treating lovers and servants alike as little more than expendable. He cycled through mistresses without pause or consideration, dismissing them on a whim, regardless of their age or social standing. Rumor had it that on one occasion, after losing a precious ring during a dice game, George demanded that the other's daughter be brought to him. His next gamble, this time with a human life. He harbored no love for his wife, treating her more as a decorative fixture at court than a partner, forbidding her any influence over domestic matters. All who served under George II were painfully aware that defiance meant death. The chronicles described chilling punishments, a servant flung barefoot into the biting January cold for as little as dropping bread or speaking a harsh word. To George, people, be they noble or humble, existed solely for his use. Watching villagers climb the steep path just to lay their offerings at his feet gave him genuine joy. From his massive seat, he would not bother to rise, instead spitting on the stone floor and lazily dictating who deserved favor and who would face the whip. Cruelty was woven into daily life at court. Acts of bribery, public shaming, and torture became routine. One town scribe recalled, he once ordered a man's fingernails torn out, all because the fellow did not bow low enough at the door. By the time the first symptoms of sickness crept in, few took notice. George grew exhausted with alarming speed, his legs remaining swollen for weeks at a time. He spoke often of a persistent buzzing deep in his bones and a crushing heaviness in his feet that left him completely unable to stand, even during the most crucial ceremonies. According to those who kept records, the Duke seemed to puff up, his body ballooning as though left baking in the summer sun. The skin on his legs sagged, blotched with bruises, and would weep with fluid if touched. Desperate for relief, he ordered warm herbal wine massaged into his feet, but comfort, when it came, always vanished quickly. The foul odor pouring off his body became overwhelming. Servants, forced into his presence, would clutch cloths to their faces, then slip away to retch in the hallways in secret. Members of his personal guard quietly prayed to be reassigned. Anything was preferable to enduring the Duke's demands, shouted as he mopped his streaming forehead with a filthy sleeve. Even royal gatherings lost their draw. Aristocrats would slip away before meeting George, complaining bitterly of the pervasive stench. Remarkably, all the while, George showed no shame for the spectacle he had become. In fact, George wielded his own repulsiveness as a weapon. He roared with delight when courtiers swooned from the smell, and on one stifling summer day, he ordered every door and window shut, forcing everyone inside to endure the full horror of courtly life under his rule. Monks whispered among themselves that such a sovereign brought misfortune, divine retribution for his unbridled greed and vice, but few dared let those thoughts escape their lips. The consequences, even for harmless jokes, could be deadly. By the time our story's first act draws to a close, George stands not only as a duke, but as a living embodiment of rot and corrupted authority. Every aspect of his existence, meals, lovers, servants, and even grand halls, became infected by dread, shame, and decay. And yet, what plagued him so far was just the beginning. The worst suffering still waited in the shadows. The latest whispers about George II's failing body traveled across Bavaria more swiftly than his own proclamations. No one, it seemed, could remember the last time the Duke had managed to rise from his throne without help. Then one day, the castle doors opened to a Hungarian ambassador, setting the stage for a new chapter. Eager to meet with George, the Hungarian ambassador lingered at the castle for 3 days, waiting in vain. Instead of an audience, he received a brief message. The Duke is preoccupied with treatments for his legs. He struggles to breathe. Return when spring comes. The palace buzzed with rumors. George now refused to attend masses or council sessions, and on the rare occasions he did emerge, it was only because 5 servants hauled his immense body across the chamber, his every lumbering step marked by a rasping wheeze. Gout consumed him with alarming speed. The joints in his hands and feet twisted painfully out of shape, his fingers ballooned, knuckles inflamed and crimson. Every movement became an exercise in agony. He dealt with this misery in the most volatile ways. If a servant faltered with a jug or misplaced a cushion, George would lash out, flinging heavy objects like iron pokers or salt shakers. His rage often spilled over onto the household dogs. More than once, unable to restrain himself, he kicked the animals and then ordered their removal from the grounds, blaming them for his affliction and insisting they be thrown out so the sickness would not spread. The chronicles left by his attendants tell of days when George's cries of torment rattled the very walls, sending children scurrying beneath benches in terror. Physicians, summoned from distant corners of Europe, crowded into his chambers, but their efforts proved fruitless. Some resorted to bleeding him with leeches, draining him of almost liters of blood in a futile bid for relief. Others plastered his limbs with foul concoctions of manure, onions, wormwood, and animal fat. George's response was as violent as his pain. He railed at his doctors, howled with agony, spat out curses, and demanded to be drenched in wine as he sat slumped in his chair, hoping for even a fleeting reprieve from the torment. Instead, each remedy seemed only to accelerate his decline. Eventually, only the most desperate or luckless of servants would enter his rooms, pressing cloths to their noses to ward off the reek. The stench from George's body became infamous even beyond his borders. Neighboring realms whispered dark jokes, claiming the Duke slathered himself with rotting meat for good luck, and that he alone bore the lingering corrupted spirit of endless celebration gone rank. French traders flatly refused to lodge in the castle whenever word spread that George remained bedridden within its walls. The bishop himself, sent to bless a new chapel, declined to even set foot in the Duke's private rooms, warning of dangers to both health and spirit. Rumors and sayings thrived. When the wind blows in from the castle, the harvest will wither, there is poison in the air. Yet the darkest tales fermented inside the palace. Servants quarreled in whispers about the meaning behind the Duke's suffering. The elders insisted his agony was justice, retribution for his gluttony, his lust, and his scorn for all things sacred. The younger staff believed in a curse, pointing to the widow whose family George had cast into the winter cold. Some recalled she had damned him with her final, shivering words. Among courtiers, black humor took root. Hell would not accept George. There was already too much foulness below. Despite all of this, the Duke's appetite for spectacle did not wane. Unable to move on his own, he ordered his chair hoisted into the great hall, insisting the banquets go on. The guests found themselves less captivated by the overflowing tables than by the tragic pageantry unfolding before them. There sat the Duke, grotesquely swollen, surrounded by platters of roasted meat and endless flagons of wine, a steaming basin set at his feet in a futile attempt to soothe the continual burning pain. On nights when agony overwhelmed him, he lashed out at the musicians, commanding them to play relentlessly, forcing music to drown out the guttural sounds of his own suffering. People quietly distanced themselves from the castle. Fishermen took long detours to avoid its shadowed walls. Farmers begged heaven that their families not be pressed into labor inside that accursed place. Even merchants, once eager to do business with the court, now demanded double the usual fee if they dared to come at all. Stories of the Duke's condition grew into legends. Children teased and taunted each other at fairs, warning, "If you misbehave, you will reek like old George." All the while, the Duke retreated further from sanity. He insisted that his castle remain enveloped in oppressive heat and utter darkness, gripped by an irrational terror of light and chill. To George, daylight signified weakness. Only the powerful belonged to the night. The windows of the castle became blanketed with tattered cloth, while planks sealed the doors from within. The chronicler of the court painted a bleak picture, writing, "The castle decays from the inside out, and its master is the first maggot." Even the monks summoned to hear his confession were received at a distance, shrouded in darkness. One of them would later note, "I never glimpsed his face. Only the sound of labored breath and rasping wheeze reached me." George himself claimed his suffering was retribution for a lifetime of indulgence, yet he defiantly clung to his lavish feasts. Throughout the land, the Duke inspired a mix of dread, pity, disgust, and hatred. Yet one fact was clear: if their sovereign was wasting away in such horror, then surely ill fortune would befall all of Bavaria. By the peak of his rule, George II had turned his estate into a citadel of decay, a fortress ruled by fear alone. No neighboring noble wanted anything to do with him. Royal envoys stopped writing. Marriage proposals and invitations simply disappeared, gathering dust in forgotten corners. Whispers spread of a messenger who returned from Franconia and declared at the threshold, "Your letter came back untouched." Duke George is now so notorious, they fear infection from the very wax that bears his crest. Even gloves provide no reassurance. In Vienna, a city notorious for embracing every kind of plot and scheme, the Duke was now mentioned only with a kind of wary contempt. It was better, people muttered, to forfeit a year's harvest than to spend even a week within those foul castle walls. Within the fortress, the mood had curdled to one of unrelenting dread. Servants abandoned their posts in droves, leaving even their meager possessions behind, anything to avoid being summoned to the Duke's rank, decaying lair. The desperate few who stayed resorted to buying their own safety, slipping bribes to overseers in hopes of escaping a shift in the dreaded chambers. In nearby villages, fear grew so great that peasants openly prayed that a pack of wolves would descend upon them, so long as it meant George's attention would pass them by. The Duke's behavior slipped into new depths of cruelty. He now insisted that every order be delivered directly before him, no matter the cost or convenience. Cut off from the outside world, George could no longer show his face in public. Instead, an unfortunate parade of courtiers, magistrates, treasurers, even humble shepherds would queue in a fetid line outside his chamber. Each was summoned in turn, forced to endure a few moments in the suffocating stench, receive a curt grunt of approval or dismissal, and then retreat as quickly as possible, desperate for a breath of clean air. At times, the Duke would attempt to inspect his realm's livestock or stores without leaving his sanctuary. Servants would be made to drag sheep or crates of grain beneath his window, while he leaned out, his face hardly visible, screaming insults and spitting down, meting out punishments to anyone who fell short of his impossible standards. His interests grew stranger by the day. George abandoned any pretense of governing, politics, military matters, and the harvest meant nothing to him now. Instead, he amused himself with cruel spectacles and outlandish stunts. Once, he commanded the entire castle courtyard to be soaked in sour wine, then watched from above as his own courtiers slipped and slid, tumbling, cursing, and tearing their clothing for his twisted entertainment. The most wretched souls found themselves pressed into repaying their so-called debts by scrubbing the Duke's chambers with nothing but their bare hands. No cloth, no gloves, just exposed skin against the filth. Some of the strongest men in the court could not endure it. Tears streamed down their faces. Some fell into spasms, and fainting became a frequent sight. As time dragged on, public opinion warped. Once, rumors of George's decay flitted quietly around the marketplace. Now they reverberated through churches and courtrooms alike. Priests did not hesitate to proclaim from the pulpit, "A season of rot engulfs our land, all born of a lord who has lost his faith." Even the written records of court matters bear the marks of this dread. One entry recalls, "Fog him as the Duke commands, but let none bring the wretch before him, for fear of spreading the Duke's corruption." Even the poorest avoided the looming castle, steering clear out of fear. After waves of dysentery swept through the nearby village, whispers rose that George's kitchens were to blame, their foul runoff cursing the very rivers that once gave the region life. His orders grew more severe and merciless by the day. There were nights when searing pain jolted George awake, and in those dark hours he demanded the entire group of musicians assemble in his chambers on the spot. It did not matter if it was the dead of night or the sun had barely set. Servants would scurry about, hustling trembling players bearing lutes and fiddles into the putrid room. The Duke would sneer, commanding them to keep playing until daybreak. Any slip, a missed note, a glance away was met with a hurled cymbal or a vicious kick. Neighbors mocked the fate of these performers. Only at George's castle can a musician lose their sight, not to poor lighting, but to the overpowering stench. Staff whispered that their master now feared even his own shadow. One night, convinced that an assassin lurked in the corridor, he ordered every door and window sealed with boards. For 3 days, the castle became a tomb of pitch darkness. Candles were forbidden. Food found its way to the Duke by nothing but memory and touch. While he sat rigid in his chair, listening for traitors in the creaking floorboards, twisting every sound into a plot to poison him. Yet it was the chilling legend of the reeking amnesty that left a scar on the Bavarian memory. Worn thin by relentless sickness and the constant drone of dissatisfied peasants, George finally issued a macabre decree. Every prisoner beneath the castle was to walk free if they could present a gift worthy of the Duke's twisted sense of grandeur. Before long, a bedraggled parade shuffled to the gates, their arms heaped with baskets of spoiled flesh, pungent fish scraps, and sacks filled with dung. When George caught sight of this grim tribute from his window, he erupted in laughter so booming it echoed beyond the riverbank, startling even the distant villagers. Hardly a week later, the plague had swept through half the community. Tales spread like wildfire that George had unleashed a curse, poisoning the very earth surrounding his fortress. By the time autumn's chill arrived, the castle was smothered in terror and misery. Hope faded fast. Nobody believed the sickness would ever leave. Children grew up with a somber warning, never to stray closer than 300 paces from those haunted walls. As mothers whispered it, it is not the Duke who inhabits that place, but the devil himself. The chroniclers wrote with grim fascination, never in history was the odor of human decay itself wielded like a scepter of power, yet under George it became so. Meanwhile, George plummeted further into madness, untethered from reality, unable to distinguish night from day or months from years. He lived shrouded in perpetual gloom, barking orders through closed doors, making sure all knew that terror did not fade even as his flesh rotted. The closing days of George II's life dragged the entire castle into a waking nightmare. Illness had given way to something more monstrous. His very existence was a seeping sore, its stench spreading for miles. The Duke never rose from his chair now, his body bloated, wholly unrecognizable, skin mottled gray, blue, and purple. Split open in places, his legs wept slick, foul fluid. Attendants covered the floor beneath him with straw, an attempt to soak up the endless pools of pus and ichor, so they would not need to carry the evidence of his living death out into the corridors. Servants tasked with tending to the Duke came and went in rapid rotation. None managed more than a few hours before they fled. The misery they endured was palpable. Nausea twisted their stomachs, their heads throbbed, and their vision blurred with tears. Whispers spread that even seasoned doctors, men who had seen horrors of every kind, abandoned their posts in disgust, cursing under their breath and refusing their wages. One afternoon, a housemaid collapsed in a faint at her post, while the chief physician, after a single night in the Duke's chambers, lost his appetite for an entire week. Yet it was not just the sickening odor that kept them in a state of dread. The Duke had grown unpredictable and violent, lobbing whatever he could grab, old food, crockery, filthy rags, even his own chamber pots, at any servant within reach. Should someone falter or move too slowly, George would shriek until his voice cracked, hurling demands for different medicines, more ointments, stronger wines. Nobody dared argue. Broken bones, fingers, or even skulls were considered merciful penalties. As the chroniclers noted, those charged with caring for the Duke did not pray for his recovery. They prayed for their own souls. Flames from candles and trails of incense never ceased flickering in George's rooms, as if the servants hoped to chase away the ever-present stench. Their efforts proved fruitless. The walls bloomed with mold, smeared with greasy, spreading stains. At night, the Duke's ragged breaths, his groans and strange murmurs, half sung, half whispered, echoed through the darkness. They have come for me, for my flesh, for my stench. Those forced to sleep just outside his door recounted nights filled with the sound of their master conversing with shadows, lost in twisted conversations only he could understand. During a stifling afternoon, a sudden sharp agony shot through the Duke's belly. For hours he writhed and moaned, shouting at the heavens, cursing his fate, even begging for mercy. Servants massed in the corridor, but none dared open the door. Only an elderly guard worked up the courage to collect the chamber pot. Emerging pale and tight-lipped, he whispered to the others, "He is already halfway to hell." When the end finally arrived, a catastrophic rupture deep within its gruesome sound thundered far beyond the walls of that accursed chamber. The sequence was unforgettable. First a shriek, then a gurgling, suffocating moan, followed abruptly by stillness. A dense, suffocating wave of stench burst out of the Duke's chamber, flooding the halls and sending even the hardiest servants and physicians scrambling for the exits. Those unlucky enough to be near described it as an odor that branded itself in memory, the very essence of death. Desperate attempts to revive George unfolded in chaos. Doctors darted about, clutching blood-stained cloths, dousing him in odd remedies like charred breadcrumbs, even suggesting a monk be fetched for a final confession. Nothing could turn back fate now. The entire castle was soon seized by terror. Windows flung open, interior doors hammered shut, all in futile attempts to trap the overwhelming reek. The stifling summer heat only hastened decay. The Duke's corpse swelled and blackened, his neck and face erupting in angry blisters. When monks at last arrived to offer last rites, they would not cross the threshold. Forced to chant their prayers from the hallway, faces buried in kerchiefs, some could not endure even a single breath before fleeing altogether. Preparations for the Duke's burial were a rushed and anxious affair. They packed the coffin's every crevice with wax and rags to block out the air and, hopefully, the stench. Under the cover of darkness, the body was carted away with desperate speed, accompanied by a second wagon piled high with his befouled bed linens. Folklore would later claim that even the horses pulling this grim procession succumbed to sickness the following day. Only a small, uneasy group gathered at the gravesite. Nobody dared get close. Those who came lurked at the cemetery's fringe, faces swaddled in cloth. The record keepers wrote, "So passed a man who knew nothing of compassion, shame, or restraint. He left behind a whirlwind of rot and ruin witnessed by all who survived him. His castle stood abandoned, its doors barred for weeks. It was well into autumn before locals ventured near those cursed walls again." Fresh rumors soon took root among the peasant stories of a pungent wind crawling from the castle on sweltering nights and an unearthly voice wailing at the moon. Bavaria had never witnessed an end so steeped in disgrace and horror, a death so absolute it erased all hope of remembrance or redemption. George II passed from life not only shunned and alone, but also denied even tranquility in the grave. After his burial, the castle stood abandoned, shrouded in silence. No one dared make it their home. Within days, ominous tales swept through the countryside. People whispered that a poisonous mist clung to the fortress after sunset, keeping animals at bay. Horses would gasp for breath, and cows produced milk so foul it could not be drunk. Some claimed that even the crows sensed the evil, refusing to land on the day of his burial, fleeing as soon as they caught wind of that cursed air. Those who had served in the Duke's household swore that, on nights when the moon was bright and full, strange noises slipped through the sealed windows, a spectral begging, or the low moans of someone enduring endless torment. Elders recounted how, on certain nights, foul gusts from the castle would blanket the village, driving people from their homes in terror and desperate prayer. Some insisted that, each summer, a greasy film coated the fortress walls, and the unmistakable sound of bare, wet feet echoed in the cellars below. A tapestry of new folklore began to unravel, whispers that the Duke's wretched spirit remained trapped, unable to cross over. One evening, a widow wandering near the crumbling ruins glimpsed a bloated face peering from a shattered window and was nearly knocked flat by a stench beyond bearing. More terrifying still were the stories of those foolish enough to pocket even a pebble from George's keep. Such thieves were cursed, doomed to endless sleeplessness, itching skin, and the relentless odor of decay clinging to their flesh. The monks, tasked with praying for his tortured soul, confessed that at times during their rituals, a frigid draught would rise through the stone floor, laced with the unmistakable reek of rot and spilt blood. More than once, young novices who accidentally blundered into the castle courtyard after dark would faint outright. For weeks afterward, they nursed mysterious blemishes on their skin and recounted chilling dreams, visions in which the Duke's bloated apparition breathed demands for new sacrifices directly into their ears. Among the villagers, a superstition took hold. Those who quarreled near the haunted fortress risked sickness and madness, as if the Duke's foul legacy seeped into every heart it touched. His wretched curse chased away any sense of peace, infecting the very fabric of the land with unrest. Even in the old folks' homes, the silence of the night was often broken by phantom knocks. People whispered that this was George himself, prowling the lanes in search of fresh victims for his infernal banquet. Sometimes, when the air grew heavy and the sun scorched the fields, a sickly green shimmer would coil through the wells around the estate, and the water would reek of decaying flesh. On such days, no one would risk a sip. Even the livestock were herded away to safer springs. People insisted that the castle walls still bore gruesome marks, fingerprints bloated and misshapen, as though pressed there by the Duke's own swollen hands. Some swore that if you stared long enough, you could see a greasy stain, a relic of sweat and fat, inching ever so slowly over the ancient stone. Yet, above all, it was the unforgettable odor that haunted them most. Even as the years slipped away, the very memory of that singular revolting scent clung to every whispered tale and memory. In the end, George II of Bavaria became more than a person. He was woven into the land itself, an everlasting blight remembered in nightmares, village legends, and the night air that, some say, still carries his presence across the Bavarian fields and lonely roads.